Barnaby Crance, do you?" inquired Miss Wilkins suspiciously.
Will nodded. He looked around at the other teachers. They were all watching him closely. "That's why I started with a prank," said Davina. "We thought you'd like that. Only I didn't know why we bothered. You didn't seem to appreciate it."
"Why didn't Mr. Crance come himself?" asked Mr. Berger. "What did he ask you to say?" demanded Miss Wilkins.
"He didn't ask us to say anything," replied Will. He just made it plain that this is where we should come."
"How did he make it plain?"
"He kept telling me about you. He said you were a bunch of old teachers and you meet in the old school here every Friday and you want to teach like you used to. He said you don't have a chance because you're living in the past and the future isn't with teachers like you anymore, but you can't understand it or you don't realise it or, well..." Will stopped, seeing the despair on the teachers' faces around him. Maybe he shouldn't have said quite so much. Suddenly he felt sorry for all these old, grey-haired, wrinkled people in their old-fashioned clothes, dreaming of a time which had gone forever. "He just said you were living in the past," Will concluded quietly, "and that you couldn't accept it."
"That's Barnaby, all right,"
muttered one of the teachers, and he sat down on one of the little desks. The other teachers nodded and murmured. A few more sat down, shaking their heads wearily.
"Let me tell you about Mr. Crance," said Miss Wilkins suddenly. "Esme, calm down," said Mr. Berger. "Please, you'll give yourself a heart attack." "No, Henry, the boy should know. He obviously thinks Barnaby is some kind of hero. Why shouldn't he know the truth?"
Mr. Berger shook his head in despair. "Esme, please," he murmured.
"Barnaby Crance used to be a member of our little society," began Miss Wilkins, fixing her gaze on Will. "Look around you, child. Do you see this room? Do you think we just found it in this condition? It took us months to find all these things here, to clean them, to repair them, to reproduce this room, to create it exactly as it was."
"And what is it exactly?" asked Davina.
"It's a classroom, child. A classroom. A place where children learned, developed, grew. A place where you might have learned, not like those cattle sheds which pass for schools today."
"That's a bit harsh, Esme," whispered Mr. Berger.
"No, it isn't, Henry. We've all been there, haven't we? We've all sat as supervisors in those dreadful learning halls. Learning halls! 1,000 students at once! What does anyone learn in them? Memorize things, yes. Facts, yes, but learn?" She turned back to Will and Stanley and Davina. "We had a dream, children. Perhaps not to take over from the learning programs again. No, perhaps that was an illusion."
"Impossible," groaned one of the teachers.
"But to recreate it at least, somewhere, in at least one place, to recreate what had been. Perhaps a few children would come, 1 or 2, 3 or 4, and we could teach them as we did in the old days. And then perhaps other children would come, and maybe that would be the start of something. Maybe the word would spread, and maybe other old teachers would set up a classroom here or there, and even train young teachers. So maybe, in time, there would be places where a child could learn properly, really learn, even if the so-called learning programs were still being used everywhere else."
Mr. Berger nodded. "That's all we wanted, children. That's all. Nothing more." "But why did you set it up in the old town?" asked Will incredulously. "Who was ever going to come here?"
"No one," said Mr. Berger. "You're right. We should have thought of that at the start. No one ever has come here. Until you, that is." "Where else could we do it, Henry?" demanded Miss Wilkins. "Who else would have given us the space? Besides, children, this was the school where we taught. This very school, Gower Hill," she murmured reverently. "I would have been the head one day. Everyone used to say so."
"I'm certain you would, Esme," murmured Mr. Berger. Miss Wilkins glanced sharply at the other teachers, and they nodded. "All of you taught here?" asked Will.
"All of us, except for Miss Carew over there. She taught at Rumble Street Primary, didn't you, dear?"
Miss Carew, a small, hunched lady with a trembling left hand, nodded quickly.
"But we don't hold that against her," added Miss Wilkins.
"Beggars can't be choosers," muttered one of the others, and hunched little Miss Carew shot him an injured glance. "Did you think of advertising on the Omninet?" asked Davina. Mr. Berger raised an eyebrow and glanced at Miss Wilkins.
"We We didn't want this to be a fad, exclaimed Miss Wilkins. We wanted people to discover us for themselves.
Mr. Berger nodded regretfully.
As for Barnaby Krantz, said Miss Wilkins, Barnaby Krantz was one of us as well, one of the first. Together with Henry and I, he started the whole thing.
But he told me you had no chance, protested Will.
That's not what he used to say, is it, Henry?
Mr. Berger shook his head.
I'll never forget the day he brought the whiteboard. He'd been all over the old town, into all the old schools, looking for one that wasn't broken. What good is a classroom without a whiteboard? Finally, he turned up one day, balancing this enormous old board on his head, all by himself. It looked like... Oh, I don't know what he looked like. What a sight it was, eh, Esme? Oh, what a sight, said Mr. Berger, and he shook his head in delight at the memory and chuckled and even wiped away a tear of nostalgia and amusement. Miss Wilkins sniffed dismissively. What happened then? Asked Will. Oh, he grew disillusioned, replied Miss Wilkins. Always such a passionate man, Barnaby Krantz. Always so impatient.
Will stared at Miss Wilkins doubtfully. Passionate? Impatient? Old Barnaby Krantz, the school housekeeper. Old Mutterbones, who sat in the foodarium all day or wandered around the lawns murmuring to himself. Miss Wilkins saw the doubt in Will's eyes.
You didn't know Barnaby Krantz when he was a young man, child, said Miss Wilkins. She fanned herself with her hand. At Gower Hill he was quite the fellow.
There were sighs from a couple of the ladies in the room. Davina glanced at Will and grinned.
But, said Miss Wilkins, recalling herself to the present, he grew disillusioned with our scheme. No children came. He said they never would. He began to say we were part of history. He said we had to face the truth. We were trying to hold back the future. We were relics of the past. The echoes of an ancient song, murmured one of the teachers wistfully. The footprints of people who have passed this way and gone. The whispering of an autumn wind that tells of summers long ago. The last soft rays of sunlight. Yes, thank you, Miss Jellybrand. We all know you taught literature. No need to show off. I wasn't showing off, Miss Wilkins, replied Miss Jellybrand in a choked voice, and she put her hand to her throat and shook her head, overcome with the emotion of their predicament. In short, said Miss Wilkins crisply, Mr. Krantz betrayed us.
Betrayed you? Said Will.
That's rather harsh, Esme, said Mr. Berger. How else would you describe it, Henry? Retorted Miss Wilkins sharply. I don't think betrayal is too strong a word. I think it fits rather well. If the cat fits, wear it.
What Miss Wilkins means, said Mr. Berger, is that Mr. Krantz decided he would leave our group because he no longer believed we had any chance of success.
He was a quitter, said Miss Wilkins. Barnaby Krantz is no quitter, replied Mr. Berger with feeling. He truly believed we had no chance, Esme. He truly believed we had to accept reality. If a man believes something, then he should act on it. What kind of a man is he if he doesn't? I respect Barnaby for that, at least. In fact, sometimes I don't know that I wouldn't. What, Henry? Demanded Miss Wilkins quickly. What would you do? Tell me, please.
Mr. Berger shook his head. Nothing, he muttered. Nothing. Miss Wilkins continued to stare at him severely for a moment and then turned back to the children.
Mr. Krantz betrayed us, she said emphatically. As Mr. Berger explained, Mr. Krantz came to believe that we did represent the past and that we were doomed to failure and that as a result we should accept reality and embrace the future.
And shouldn't you? Asked Will. Miss Wilkins stared at him blankly. Will glanced around at the other teachers. They had all looked up and were gazing avidly at her, waiting to see what she would reply. Will had the feeling that this was a question none of them had dared to put to Miss Wilkins before, or if they had put it to her, she hadn't given an answer.
Whether we should or shouldn't, that's hardly the issue, replied Miss Wilkins at last.
What is the issue, Esme? Asked Mr. Berger softly.
He betrayed us, Henry! To say that he no longer believes, to say he no longer wants to work with us. Yes, that I can accept. That I can understand. It's his right. But to join Gelmet, That's what he said he was going to do, isn't it? The last time we saw him? Gelmet, the worst of the lot. If there's one man who stands for everything we oppose, everything we revile, everything we despise, it's Alphonse Gelmet. So who does Barnaby choose to join? That's the betrayal, Henry. He could have just walked away. He could have gone back to the learning halls. He could have joined anyone else, but not Gelmet, Henry. Not Gelmet. Miss Wilkins' voice trailed away in pain and disbelief. It's like a slap in the face, she whispered. There was silence in the room. The teachers nodded or shook their heads or just stared vacantly at the thought of Krantz's betrayal. So you see, children, said Miss Wilkins eventually, recovering herself, you've come to the wrong place. If you thought Barnaby didn't mean what he said, you're wrong. He meant every word. He does believe we are the past. He does believe Gelmet is the future. And if he told you about us, it wasn't a way of telling you to come here. It was only to laugh and mock at us. No, Miss Wilkins, said Will, and he couldn't help feeling sorry for the fiery old teacher, despite the ridiculous bun on her head and the horrible way she treated the other teachers and her obvious blind conviction that she was always right and, well, despite all the things that made Miss Wilkins, and in fact, possibly because of them. No, said Will again. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't, Miss Wilkins, believe me. Barnaby isn't a man to mock, Esme, said Mr. Berger. He never was. Perhaps, said Miss Wilkins reluctantly. She was silent for a moment longer. Then she frowned. How do you know him, child? She asked suddenly. He's with Gelmet, isn't he? Will nodded. Then, Miss Wilkins put her hand to her chest. Oh, Henry, I think they've given me a heart attack. Esme? Henry! Don't you see? They've escaped! There was a gasp from the teachers. They all jumped up and crowded around the children again. Miss Wilkins, who seemed to recover from her heart attacks as quickly as she had them, pushed to the front of the group. You've escaped, haven't you? Will, Davina and Stanley glanced at each other uncertainly. Bennett nodded. He'd escaped, that was for sure, if she was talking about the shoe drawer. I don't know if I'd say we escaped, began Will. Oh, you poor children, cried Miss Wilkins. Are you hungry? Henry, have we got some food? Someone get them some food. Oh, we've seen. Oh, you poor things, the conditions you've been kept in. What a place, what a terrible place. We've seen it, we've found it ourselves. Oh, children, such brutality, such barbarism. Will frowned. What a terrible place? Brutality? Barbarism? The conditions at the academy weren't exactly barbaric. Oh, you're right, Miss Wilkins, said Davina. You're absolutely right. Sometimes the temperature of the pool is much too warm. It's all right if you want to just play around, but how are you meant to swim serious laps? The pool? Said Miss Wilkins. Too warm, said Mr. Berger. Oh, not always, said Davina quickly. Don't get me wrong, and Mr. Targ did say he'd see what he could do about it. The teacher stared at Davina as if she were talking complete gibberish. Will frowned. Miss Wilkins, he said, when you say that you've seen the conditions, well, exactly where have you seen them? At Professor Gelmet's Institute, of course. And where is that? Well, you know, don't you, if you've escaped from there? Silly boy, it's only 2 streets away. Only 2 streets away, said Will. Of course. From here. Miss Wilkins turned to Mr. Berger in exasperation. See, she whispered, see what he's done to them? The child hasn't got a brain left in his head, and Barnaby calls this the future? Will glanced at Stanley. Stanley shook his head in puzzlement. Will didn't understand. 2 streets away? What was Miss Wilkins talking about? Suddenly it occurred to him, if Miss Wilkins was familiar with the Gelmet Academy, why had it taken so long for her to realise they had come from there? Why hadn't she recognised their uniforms straight away? They were all dressed in the unmistakable purple of the academy with the GA logo on their chests. Surely, if she had been to the academy, if she had seen any of the children there, she would have recognised their uniforms. Why had she had to ask where they were from? Miss Wilkins, he said, we haven't escaped from 2 streets away. But you said you came from Professor Gelmet's Institute. His academy. Don't split hairs, boy. I don't think I am splitting hairs. We've come from his academy. No one ever calls it an institute. On the hill, outside the new town. No, child, Miss Wilkins smiled pityingly. Professor Gelmet's Institute isn't on a hill outside the new town. You're confused. They give you so little to eat, you're hallucinating. The institute is in an old factory on Bridge Street, in the old town.
We get plenty to eat, said Davina.
Esme, they do look well fed, murmured Mr. Berger. And swimming pools! Child, you really have been hallucinating. We've seen the conditions. We managed to get in. We know what it's like. There are no swimming pools there.
I swim every day.
Every day, said Miss Wilkins disbelievingly.
Just about.
See, Henry, demanded Miss Wilkins. See what he's done to them. Look how confused they are. They've lost touch with reality.
Will stared at her. Why did she keep saying those things? Why did she keep saying the conditions were so terrible at the academy? And why did she say the academy was in the old town? The academy was nowhere near the old town.
Miss Wilkins, he said suddenly, interrupting the old teacher as she continued to tell Mr. Berger how confused they were. They've lost their manners too, remarked Miss Wilkins. Miss Wilkins, I'm not confused. Miss Wilkins looked at him severely, arching one eyebrow. Miss Wilkins, said Will, there's only one way to explain this. And what would that be, child?
Professor Gelmet has 2 academies. Thanks for joining us. Tune in tomorrow for another chapter of Will Buster and the Gelmet Helmet.